The discovery Isabella Chen adjusted the silk curtains of her Pacific Heights mansion. Watching the morning fog roll across San Francisco Bay, 20 years of marriage to tech mogul David Chen had taught her to find beauty in routine. Even when that routine felt increasingly hollow, the house, with its museum-quality art collection and panoramic views, had once felt like a sanctuary. Now it felt more like a beautiful prison. She descended the marble staircase, her bare feet silent against the cool stone. David's absence at breakfast had become normal over the past 6 months. Emergency board meetings, he'd explain, or investor calls with Tokyo. She'd learned not to question these explanations, though the frequency troubled her more than she cared to admit. In the kitchen, she poured herself coffee from the French press, inhaling the rich aroma of the Colombian beans David imported specially. For her, such small gestures had once meant everything. Now they felt like compensation for something unnamed, something growing between them like a shadow. The garage door's mechanical hum announced David's departure for another 14-hour day at Chen Technologies. Isabella watched through the window as his black Tesla disappeared down the winding driveway. She'd married him when he was still coding in his Stanford dorm room, believing in his vision when no one else would. Together, they'd built an empire, worth billions, though somewhere along the way, she'd lost herself in his success. Finishing her coffee, Isabella decided to retrieve her forgotten sunglasses from David's car. She rarely drove anymore. Marcus, their assistant, handled most errands, but today felt different. She needed to move, to do something with her hands. The garage smelled of expensive leather and David's cologne. It's a weekend car, a vintage Porsche. He'd restored himself, sat gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She opened the passenger door and immediately saw her sunglasses on the seat. But as she reached for them, something else caught her eye. Wedged between the seat cushions was a tube of lipstick. Not hers. She recognized every shade in her collection. This was different. A bold crimson called Dangerous Liaison by a brand she'd never heard of. The tube was expensive, heavy, with an unusual Art Deco design. More troubling was its position. Clearly dropped accidentally, and the fact that it had been used recently. Isabella held the lipstick up to the light, her mind racing. David claimed he'd spent last weekend at a tech conference in Seattle, alone. But this lipstick told a different story. Her hands trembled slightly as she considered the implications. 20 years of marriage, 2 decades of supporting his dreams, of sacrificing her own career and art curation to be the perfect wife. If David was having an affair, everything she'd built her life around was a lie. She slipped the lipstick into her robe pocket, her decision made. She wouldn't confront him, not yet. Instead, she would investigate carefully and methodically. If David was betraying her, she would need proof. And then she would decide what to do with the truth. The morning fog was lifting, revealing a crystal-clear day ahead. The investigation. Marcus Rivera had worked for the Chen family for 8 years, long enough to read the subtle shifts in Isabella's demeanor. When she called him into the study that Tuesday morning, he immediately noticed the change of sharpness in her eyes that reminded him of his days as a private investigator, before he'd traded surveillance for scheduling and personal assistance. "I need your help with something delicate," Isabella said, closing the study door behind them. She pulled the crimson lipstick from her desk drawer, setting it carefully on the mahogany surface between them. "I found this in David's car yesterday." Marcus examined the tube without touching it, his trained eye noting details others might miss. The brand was exclusive, sold only in high-end boutiques in 3 cities: New York, Los Angeles, and Paris. The wear pattern on the bullet suggested recent, frequent use. Most telling was a small smudge of the color on the tube's exterior. Someone had been careless. "You want me to find out who it belongs to?" he said. It wasn't a question. Isabella nodded discreetly. "I need to know if David is... But she couldn't finish the sentence. 20 years of marriage making the words feel like betrayal, even in suspicion. Marcus understood. He'd seen this scenario play out in his previous career, wealthy spouses discovering infidelity through the smallest clues. But Isabella was different from his former clients. She wasn't looking for ammunition for divorce proceedings or public humiliation. She wanted truth, nothing more or less. Over the next week, Marcus employed skills he'd hoped never to use again. He tracked David's movements through credit card statements Isabella provided, cross-referenced restaurant receipts with David's claimed whereabouts, discreetly photographed the tech mogul during his lunch meetings downtown. The breakthrough came on Thursday evening. Following David to an upscale gallery opening in Soma, Marcus watched from across the street as David embraced a striking brunette in her 30s. She wore the exact shade of lipstick Isabella had found dangerous liaison and kissed David's cheek in greeting, leaving a faint mark he quickly wiped away. Marcus snapped photos with a telephoto lens, documenting their intimate conversation, the way David's hand lingered on her lower back, how she leaned into him when they laughed. The woman was elegant, confident, wearing a designer dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. She wasn't some casual flink. This had the appearance of a serious relationship. Research revealed her identity: Victoria Ashford, prominent art dealer who'd recently opened her own gallery. She's divorced, successful, and according to social media, recently returned from a buying trip to Paris where dangerous liaison. Lipstick was exclusively available until last month, but as Marcus dug deeper, something didn't fit. Victoria's social media showed her in New York during David's supposed Seattle conference weekend. The timeline was wrong. If she wasn't with David that weekend, who was? And more puzzling, why would Victoria be so careless with her lipstick? In David's car, when she appeared shrewd and calculating in every other aspect of her life, Marcus spent another 3 days following both David and Victoria separately. What he discovered changed everything. Victoria was indeed involved with David, but their relationship was purely professional. She was helping him plan something: late-night meetings, hushed phone calls, mysterious packages delivered to her gallery. The real shock came when Marcus followed one of those packages. It led him to a high-end jewelry store where David had commissioned a custom piece knot for Victoria, but according to the jeweler's records, for I.C. Isabella Chen. As Marcus compiled his findings, he realized the truth was far more complex than a simple affair. David was hiding something, but it might not be what Isabella suspected. The lipstick remained a mystery, its owner still unknown. But Marcus had learned long ago that in investigations, the most obvious answer was rarely the complete truth. He prepared his report for Isabella, knowing it would raise more questions than it answered. The preparation: Sophia Blackwood hadn't spoken to her sister Isabella in 3 years. Not since their bitter argument about family loyalty and personal ambition. So when Isabella's call came at midnight, Sophia almost didn't answer. But something in her sister's voice, of vulnerability she hadn't heard since they were children, made her book the next flight from New York to San Francisco. Sophia found Isabella in the conservatory of the Pacific Heights mansion, surrounded by canvases she'd forgotten her sister still painted. The morning light caught the auburn highlights in Isabella's hair, making her look younger than her 42 years. More like the art student Sophia remembered from Isabella's Columbia days. "I need to disappear," Isabella said without preamble, not bothering with apologies or explanations for their estrangement. "For a few weeks, maybe longer." Sophia studied her sister's face, noting the tension around her eyes, the way she held her shoulders too rigidly. In her work as a marketing strategist for luxury brands, Sophia had learned to read people quickly and accurately. Isabella was preparing for war, though against what enemy remained unclear. "What's David done?" Sophia asked, settling into the wicker chair across from her sister. Isabella explained about the lipstick, Marcus's investigation, the mysterious meetings with Victoria Ashford. But as she spoke, Sophia sensed there was more, something Isabella wasn't sharing, perhaps something she hadn't fully admitted to herself. "You think he's planning to leave you?" Sophia said when Isabella finished. "I think he's been planning it for months. It's the secret meetings, the jewelry commission, probably a goodbye gift to ease his conscience." Isabella's laugh was bitter. 20 years, Sophia. I gave up everything for his dream." But Sophia knew her sister better than that. Isabella had never been passive, never simply a victim of circumstance. Even as children, when Isabella felt cornered, she became strategic, calculating. The conservatory itself proved that Tisabella had been painting again, something she'd abandoned when she married David. These weren't the works of someone giving up. They were the creations of someone preparing to reclaim herself. "What do you want to do?" Sophia asked. Isabella stood and walked to the window overlooking the bay. "Remember the gallery space we looked at in Chelsea 5 years ago? The one I fell in love with, but David convinced me was too risky." Sophia nodded. She'd thought at the time that Isabella was making a mistake, choosing security over passion. But she'd held her tongue, respecting her sister's marriage even when she disagreed with it. "Still available," Isabella continued. "I've been tracking it, watching the market, analyzing the potential. I have enough in my personal accounts to make it work money from before the marriage. Investments David doesn't know about." Over the next 2 weeks, the sisters worked with the intensity they'd once brought to their childhood schemes. Sophia used her network to identify emerging artists whose work would launch Isabella's gallery with impact. They researched competing galleries, analyzed market trends, developed a brand identity that would position Isabella not as David Chin's wife, but as a formidable force in the art world. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Isabella would quietly leave San Francisco, ostensibly for a personal retreat to consider her marriage. But instead of soul-searching, she'd be in New York, finalizing gallery preparations. The opening would coincide with the city's major art fair, ensuring maximum industry attention. Sophia's masterstroke was the timing. She'd learned through industry contacts that David was planning something significant for their anniversary next month, likely the moment he'd intended to present. Isabella with the custom jewelry and whatever conversation it was meant to facilitate. But Isabella would be gone by then, having already announced her gallery opening to the art world. "You're sure about this?" Sophia asked, as they reviewed the final plans. "Once we announce the gallery, there's no going back. You'll be making a statement about who you are, separate from David." Isabella looked around the conservatory. At the paintings she'd hidden from David's business associates, at the life she'd built in the shadows of someone else's success. The lipstick sat on the glass table between them. Evidence of betrayal. Any more but a catalyst for transformation. "I've been hiding for 20 years, Isabella said. "It's time to let the world see what I can do." The sisters smiled at each other, their estrangement forgotten in the face of a common purpose. Isabella. Chen was about to disappear, but she would re-emerge as someone entirely new. The revelation David Chen stood in his empty house, the silence echoing off marble floors that had once resonated with Isabella's laughter. 3 weeks had passed since she'd left for her personal retreat. 3 weeks of unanswered calls and carefully worded text messages that revealed nothing about her location or state of mind. The custom anniversary necklace sat in its velvet box on his desk, $2 million symbol of his failure to understand his own wife. Marcus had given his notice that morning, claiming a family emergency that required his immediate relocation. To New York, the timing felt suspicious, but David had larger concerns. Chen Technologies' quarterly earnings were strong, investor confidence high, yet he couldn't focus on anything beyond Isabella's absence and the growing certainty that he'd lost something irreplaceable. The call from his publicist came at 2 p.m. Pacific time, just as the New York art world was buzzing with afternoon gossip. "David, we have a situation. Your wife is on the cover of Art News magazine. The headline is 'The Return of Isabella Chen, from Silicon Valley Shadow to Gallery Sovereign.'" Hands shook as he pulled up the digital edition on his tablet. There was Isabella, radiant in a way he hadn't seen in years, standing in what appeared to be a sophisticated Chelsea gallery space. She wore black, elegant, powerful, and her smile held secrets he'd never been privy to. The article described her as a formidable new presence in contemporary art, someone who'd been quietly developing her vision while supporting her husband's technological empire. But it was the sidebar that made David's blood run cold. Chen's new venture coincides with whispers about trouble in her 20-year marriage to tech mogul David Chen, whose recent behavior has sparked speculation about the couple's future. Phone rang immediately. Victoria Ashford, the art dealer he'd secretly commissioned to help plan Isabella's anniversary surprise, a private showing of rare pieces by Isabella's favorite artists. meant to accompany his announcement that he was stepping back from day-to-day operations to support her return to the art world. "David, I'm so sorry." Victoria's voice was strained. "I had no idea Isabella was planning this. The whole art community is talking about her gallery opening. It's brilliant. Actually, she's positioned herself perfectly for the fall season."
David
barely heard her. He was reading the article, learning about his wife's secret preparations, her careful market analysis, her connections to artists he'd never heard her mention. The woman described in these pages wasn't the supportive spouse he thought he knew. She was a strategic thinker. Someone who'd been planning her independence while he'd been planning her surprise, his assistant. Marcus's temporary replacement knocked on his office door. "Mr. Chen, there are reporters calling. They want comments about your wife's new gallery and whether this signals changes in your marriage." David dismissed him with a wave, his mind racing through the past months. Isabella's frequent spa days that he'd barely questioned, her renewed interest in art books and gallery catalogs. The way she'd seemed distracted during their conversations, as if her mind was elsewhere. He'd attributed it to midlife restlessness, never suspecting she was orchestrating her own renaissance. The crimson lipstick sat in his desk. Drawer he'd found it weeks ago in his car and had been meaning to ask Isabella about it. Now he understood. It wasn't evidence of an affair. It was evidence of his wife's careful planning. She'd probably planted it herself, testing his honesty, waiting to see if he'd mentioned finding it. His failure to bring it up had likely confirmed whatever suspicions she'd harbored about his secretiveness regarding the anniversary surprise. By evening, Chen Technologies stock had dropped 2% on speculation about David's personal life affecting his business focus. His lawyers were fielding calls from reporters, and his mother had left 6 increasingly frantic voicemails, asking why she'd learned about Isabella's career change from the news. David poured himself a scotch and stood on his terrace. Out at the bay where Isabella had once planned to build a sculpture garden, he'd convinced her the permits would be too complicated, the maintenance too expensive. Now he realized he'd been convincing her to stay small, to remain in his shadow. The woman in the art news photographs looked nothing like someone who'd accept a shadow anymore. Isabella had declared her independence not through confrontation or drama, but through strategic excellence. She'd outmaneuvered him completely, using his own secretiveness against him while building something magnificent. For the first time in their marriage, David Chen felt like the smaller person in the relationship. The Renaissance 6 months after her gallery opening, Isabella Chen stood before a room filled with New York's cultural elite, preparing to announce her latest acquisition, a collection of emerging Asian American artists that would tour internationally. The woman who had once introduced herself as David Chen's wife now commanded attention as simply Isabella Chen, gallery owner and art patron. The crimson lipstick sat framed on her office wall, not as evidence of betrayal, but as a reminder of transformation. She'd never told anyone, not even Sophia, that she'd planted it herself. It's a test of David's honesty that he'd failed spectacularly. His inability to mention finding it had confirmed what she'd suspected. If he could lie about small things, what else was he hiding? Marcus approached with the evening's final numbers. Her assistant-turned-business partner had proven invaluable. His investigative skills now focused on vetting artists and authenticating pieces. "The Yamamoto sculpture sold," he reported, "and 3 collectors are interested in commissioning pieces from your emerging artists program." Isabella nodded, watching through the gallery windows as snow began to fall on Chelsea's quiet streets. David had called that morning their first conversation in 2 months. He'd sounded different, smaller somehow, asking not about reconciliation, but about her happiness. She'd been honest. She was happier than she'd been in years. The divorce papers sat unsigned on her desk at home. David wasn't contesting anything. He'd offered her half of everything, including properties she'd forgotten they owned. But Isabella had discovered something more valuable than his money. She'd rediscovered herself. Sophia appeared at her elbow, elegant in the black dress that had become her uniform since moving to New York to manage Isabella's business expansion. "The Times critic wants to interview you next week about the new contemporary women's initiative." "Schedule it," Isabella said, her reflection caught in the gallery window, confident, purposeful, free. The scared woman who'd found a lipstick in her husband's car had disappeared, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes the greatest betrayals lead to the greatest discoveries. She'd thought she was investigating David's secrets, but she'd actually been uncovering her own strength. The lipstick hadn't revealed his lies, it had revealed her truth. She was no longer someone's wife, or shadow, or supporting character. Isabella Chen had finally become herself. The gallery buzzed with conversation about art and possibility, the sound of a new life being lived fully. Outside, the snow continued falling, covering the city in fresh whiteness, making everything clean and new.